Thank you very much, Jerry, and thank you to John O'Sullivan and the Danube Institute for inviting me to talk about the work that I do at the American Enterprise Institute, where I study public opinion polls. We don't conduct any surveys of our own, we simply report on those in the public domain. And while I believe that polls are a very useful tool to understand complex publics, I don't think that they should ever be used to make policy. They're too crude and too blunt for that purpose. The story of public reaction to the financial crisis, and this is an interim report, is a complicated one, but I'm very hopeful. I'd like to start by taking you back to September of 2008. At that time, of course, most Americans were focused on our presidential election. We were just about to elect the first African-American president. We were in a recession, and clearly you could find that in the public opinion polls. But when Lehman Brothers collapsed, Americans became riveted to the crisis. The University of Michigan's Index of Consumer Sentiment reported the largest monthly decline in the 54-year history of that index. The Pew Research Center, which has been asking Americans every week since 1985 about the news stories that they're paying closest attention to, found that 70% of Americans were following the financial situation very closely. The only other two events to come near that in terms of public attention were the 9/11 attacks and the tragedy of the Space Shuttle Challenger in 1986. Many Americans were afraid. That's not an emotion that you see very often in public opinion polls in the United States, yet 40% told Americans they were afraid, and 55% told the pollsters that they were angry. Americans worried in early October and in November that this was going to lead to a Great Depression. So this was a very serious situation in terms of public opinion, with numbers that we had not seen in the long history of the 75-year history of public opinion polls. People's views of their own finances deteriorated, and Gallup reported that the number of people having confidence in their financial situation in the next year tied for the most negative reading in Gallup's 32-year history of asking that question. Peter and Jack talked this morning about the causes of the financial crisis, and Peter suggested that in fact the malefactors of great wealth, the Roosevelt expression, were not very popular at the time of the crisis, and this is certainly true in the public opinion data, and much of the blame for the crisis was directed at large financial institutions, typically lumped together in the public mind as Wall Street. These institutions are, of course, very far removed from most Americans' lives. For much of the public, the workings of the financial sector are a mystery. Wall Street's wealth is also hard for most Americans to comprehend. In a poll this year conducted by The Economist, 63% of Americans said that they did not know anyone who was a millionaire, but 51% of Americans said that they knew someone who had lost a job during the financial crisis, and 7% said that that had happened to them. The financial lives of the money moguls and people on Wall Street, or NBA players or Hollywood stars, are also very far removed from most Americans, and they're very hard for Americans to comprehend. Polls over the decades show that Americans neither admire nor do they particularly resent the rich. Gallup has been asking a question a number of times since the 1990s, and it shows that Americans believe that we benefit by having a class of rich people. Americans aren't inclined to a politics of envy, but when many are just getting by, the behavior of some people on Wall Street and the serious damage inflicted on the economy were bound to provoke negative feelings among ordinary Americans. Confidence in the people running Wall Street dropped to its lowest level ever. Only 4% said that they had a great deal of confidence in a Harris poll of those running Wall Street, and 57% said that they had hardly any. Those answers are the respective low and high points in the 23-year trend on that particular question. As I said, it's not that Wall Street was particularly popular before the crash, but yet you find that this one was different in many ways in Americans' opinions, because many people believed that for the first time in questions that I had seen, that Wall Street brokers could not at all be trusted to do what was right for the economy. And of course, a lot of that comes from Americans' views of the greed of Wall Street. The pollsters asked whether or not people on Wall Street are as honest and moral as other people. That response dropped to 26% after the crash. Would most people on Wall Street be willing to break the law if they believed that they could make a lot of money and get away with it? That rose to 71% in 2009. 79% of Americans told the Atlantic pollsters in 2012 that the executives on Wall Street have a different set of values than they themselves do. And all of these numbers tanked after the financial crisis. A silver lining, or at least a pale gray one in the data, is that most Americans continue to view Wall Street as absolutely necessary to the functioning of the economy because it provides the money that businesses must have for their investments. But as long as Wall Street is seen as unethical, greedy, and possibly corrupt, Americans will continue to worry about the capacity of large financial institutions to derail the economy. And that's what we saw in 2008 and 2009. Pollsters have asked occasional questions about banks, and I'm going to talk about them separately because public opinion pollsters ask the questions that way for at least 75 years. And our confidence in banks dropped during the financial crisis, and they were clearly slipping before that time during the recession. But what's been interesting in public opinion is that the banks are recovering, and Gallup reported this year that of all the 16 institutions that they examined, confidence in banks increased the most of any institution in the 16 that they surveyed. So banks are actually on the way back. Business, much more broadly, emerged from the financial crisis virtually unscathed. Confidence declined after the crash, but the decline in confidence in business, it coincided with the start of the 2001 recession with a brief pause after 9/11. Where we have recent data, again, attitudes toward businesses are beginning to return to pre-crash levels. The blame that Americans directed toward Wall Street did not spread to the business community as a whole. If you look at business compared to other institutions in the United States, you get a sense of why businesses remained remarkably popular. The dysfunction in Washington, the level of distrust of the major governmental institutions is so low at this particular point that business looks mighty good by comparison. And I think that's another reason. If you look, for example, at attitudes toward Congress currently, the lowest numbers on record since the pollsters began asking about the institution in 1974, and business much more highly regarded overall. One of the most interesting things that we saw during the financial crisis was the response in terms of public concern about government regulation of Wall Street and government regulation of business as a whole. Americans wanted to clamp down on Wall Street. Again, they didn't know any of the specifics, and again, these polls are very broad in general. And certainly legislators on Capitol Hill took this as support for the idea of the Dodd-Frank regulation. But even though we wanted the feds to crack down on Wall Street, we've seen opinion tilt away from greater regulation of American business. And in fact, those two trends are moving in opposite direction. And today we have some of the highest anti-regulatory sentiment that we've seen in American public opinion in a long time. For example, in a Gallup poll of 2010, 61% said that they approved of increased government regulation of banks and financial institutions. But in that very same poll, Americans disapproved of the economic stimulus legislation that had passed. They disapproved of the government aid to banks and financial institutions. They disapproved of the government's auto bailout overall, even though the automakers were in the question in danger of going bankrupt. Americans only initially supported TARP, the bailout of the banks, and during the second tranche, opinion had turned remarkably negative about that overall. Again, the skepticism about government's ability to deal with the economy. But in an economy that's been on its back for 4 years, Americans clearly do not want to harm it further, and that's why you're seeing, I believe, high levels of anti-regulatory sentiment and public opinion overall. I was particularly interested in opinion after the crash and views about the system of free enterprise, because I think, as we all know, the free enterprise system is a social and political artifact, and for its survival, it depends on the consent of the public. So I was particularly interested in what the polls would have to say about this overall. And interestingly, again, another surprise. We've seen no change whatsoever in the strong American support for the free enterprise system. Capitalism has never been quite as popular as the free enterprise system, but once again, no change in views about the free enterprise system. Most Americans see business as the engine of growth and of American success. And in one of the most interesting questions asked during the crisis, but asked 12 times before the crisis began, and it's asked about 5 times afterwards, is a question posed by the Pew Research Center. And the question asks whether the strength of the American system is based mostly on the success of American business. 75% before the crash, 75% in 2009, and today 77% of the strength of America is based on the success of American business. No change whatsoever on that question. As I said, views of free enterprise remain very positive. 89% in a November 2012 Gallup poll had a positive image of the words free enterprise. Again, capitalism a little less highly regarded. And I think one of the reasons of the weakness of the term capitalism in the public mind is because people often think about economic inequality when they hear the word capitalism. On 12 occasions since 1984, Gallup has asked people whether or not the distribution of money and wealth in this country today is fair, or whether money and wealth should be more evenly distributed. And a large percentage of the public say that wealth should be more evenly distributed. But when you ask whether or not government should be involved, and particularly the federal government should be involved in the redistribution of wealth, the public balks considerably. And I think the reason is, again, because of the deep dissatisfaction with government and because of suspicion about what government could do in this particular area. I think one of the reasons that we have not seen growing public concern about inequality, though it's certainly there in the survey data, is because the belief that opportunity is present in America tends to act as a solvent for concerns about inequality. It doesn't eliminate those concerns, but it makes the gaps that people see between themselves and the rich less politically potent. This explains, again, why people are generally unsympathetic to government redistribution of wealth. Americans accept considerable inequality in their society as long as it is not seen as excessive and everyone gets a fair shake. And here's one of the areas where we've seen a significant change over the last 15 years. White Americans no longer believe that their children will do better than they have done, whereas African Americans and Hispanics are quite confident that their children will do better than they've done. Again, starting at a much lower base overall, but a very significant change in public opinion overall. But if those at the top are seen as gaining at the expense of others and harming the economy, the latent concerns do tend to surface, and that's certainly what happened in the public opinion data for a short time, and it lit a fire under the Occupy Wall Street movement. But that could not be sustained in the United States, and the popularity of the movement quickly faded. In the initial stages of the protest, the focus was largely on Wall Street and its transgressions. But as the movement expanded its activity, its target shifted from Wall Street, specifically to the free enterprise system more generally. And I suspect that this tactic partly explains the group's decline. Again, we've just seen a very liberal mayor elected in New York City, so the sentiment is still there, someone who believes in significant redistribution of American wealth. And again, as I said, it's there, but it's usually tamped down by concerns about government involvement in this area overall. I wanted to close with a poll that just came across my desk this week. This was a question asked with a 7-point scale. Strongly agree was 0.1 and 0.2. And people were asked whether they agreed, and strongly disagree was 0.7, whether or not they agreed with this statement. I'm proud to live in a free market country where individuals have the freedom to become successful and wealthy. The number of Americans who put themselves at 0.1 on that scale, strongly approving of that statement, was a solid majority, 52%. So this interim report on public attitudes toward the financial crisis suggests that there certainly was damage done in public opinion, but the American people are recovering in terms of their views about their financial system. And with the exception of Wall Street, we've seen very significant positive moves in the direction of support for banks, and business in general, as I suggested, was hardly affected at all. Thank you very much.